You know, we've all heard about emotional intelligence, right? EQ. It's talked about everywhere, praised as this amazing tool for creating empathy and well-being in our schools and our workplaces. But what if there's another side to that story? Let's dive into a really powerful critique that questions the whole foundation of EQ.
And that brings us to the core question of this whole explainer. Is emotional intelligence really a tool for compassion? Or could it be, maybe, a very subtle form of control? I know, it's a provocative thought, but we're going to unpack the argument behind it.
Okay, first, let's be fair. Let's look at the promise of EQ and what's called social emotional learning, or SEL. I mean, the goals here are fantastic. Kinder students, better well-being, social harmony, more empathy. Who wouldn't want that? On the surface, what's not to love?
But now, let's make a pivot, because this entire explainer is based on the work of a researcher named Christine Jones, and she argues that there's a kind of hidden substitution going on here, one that could totally change the entire purpose of education as we know it.
So our source here is Christine Jones. She's got 25 years of experience in education, and her argument is pretty bold. She's saying this isn't just some small tweak to teaching methods. No, this is a deep philosophical shift that she believes could actually undermine the very foundation of a self-governing society.
And this quote from her, it just nails the core of her thesis. She says, the shift isn't just about teaching, it's civic. It's about where authority comes from. She argues it's moving away from objective truth and reason and towards subjective feeling and data. And the result? We go from being self-governing citizens to, in her words, psychologically managed subjects.
So here's the central conflict she lays out. On one side, you've got logos. Think of it as reason, logic, the belief that there's an objective reality out there that we can understand. But on the other side, you have pathos. This is all about feeling, emotion, and subjective experience. The argument is that education is fundamentally shifting its entire focus away from logos and over to pathos.
Okay, so how did a big philosophical shift like this actually happen? I mean, it's one thing to talk about these big ideas, but how is it actually implemented in the real world? Let's take a look at the operational playbook that the source material describes.
Jones breaks it down into a four-part system. It all starts, she says, with a philosophical idea called immanentism. Now that's a fancy word, but it just means the belief that truth isn't something external you discover, but something that comes from inside you, from your own inner experience. Then, organizations like the Fetzer Institute come in and act as a funding engine, translating that philosophy into real-world practices. After that, you get a psychological interface, people like Daniel Golem, who package it all up as emotional intelligence and sell it as a scientific and moral good. And finally, it's delivered into the classroom as EQ and SEL, which trains students to treat their feelings as the primary guide. Let's zoom in on that funding engine for a second. The source points to the Fetzer Institute and highlights some of its stated goals, like cultivating inner knowing and advancing ethics without specific doctrines. Jones's argument is that this kind of framework is designed to replace an external objective moral authority with a managed internal subjective one. All right, so all of this sets up a huge clash between two completely different models for education, two different ideas of what a person even is. You have the classical model, and then you have what the source calls the new emotional model. And the contrast here is really stark. Look at the classical order. The idea is that reality can be understood and that truth exists outside of us. So the whole point of education is to shape a student's judgment to see that truth. But in what's called the immanentist inversion, reality is just something to be experienced, truth comes from inside you. So education's job shifts to cultivating your feelings as the signals of what's true. Now, this is where the argument gets really sharp. The claim is that EQ isn't some new, enlightened step forward in education. Instead, it's basically a clever repackaging of old-school behaviorism, just with a modern internal twist. And this matrix is pretty fascinating. It draws a direct line between early behaviorism and the modern EQ model. For old-school behaviorism, the main control lever was external, pleasure and pain. For EQ, the lever is internal, emotional comfort versus discomfort. But the source argues the end goal is pretty much the same: a compliant, well-adjusted individual, not necessarily a self-governing moral agent. And this quote just perfectly summarizes that last point. The argument is that EQ doesn't get rid of behaviorism, it completes it. How? By moving the whole conditioning mechanism inside of you.
So now students learn to regulate themselves based on emotional cues, basically becoming their own conditioners.
So you might be thinking, okay, this is an interesting debate for educators. But according to this critique, this isn't just some academic squabble. It has massive implications for all of society. In fact, the source calls this shift constitutionally fatal. So, what does that even mean?
Well, let's look at the classical, logos-based view. The path to freedom here is pretty straightforward. You start with reason, which leads to good judgment. That good judgment allows you to rule yourself, and self-rule, well, that's the absolute cornerstone of freedom in a republic.
Now contrast that with the pathos-based model. Here, the starting point isn't reason, it's affect, or feeling. The main goal becomes regulating that feeling to achieve social adjustment. The argument is that this path doesn't lead to freedom, but to a kind of dependence on external systems and other people for validation and safety.
So, what does this all boil down to? The critique claims that we are losing one single, absolutely core capacity, the ability to recognize objective truth and from there to govern ourselves. Jones argues that this skill is the bedrock of a constitutional republic, and if it goes away, the whole system is in jeopardy.
And so we end right back where we started, but with a much sharper question. What is the real, ultimate goal of education? Is it to form citizens who are capable of judging truth even when it's hard or uncomfortable? Or is it to produce well-adjusted subjects who are really skilled at emotional regulation and keeping social harmony? According to this analysis, the answer we choose could very well determine the future of self-governance itself.